Paul, thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to talking over some of the IR35 changes and how that impacts the supply chain and your everyday talent strategy. So would you like to very quickly introduce yourself to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, my name's Paul Lloyd. I'm the Sales Director for Brookson Group. So I spent the last 6 years working across the industry, helping from an IR35 point of view through Brookson Legal, AWR and Criminal Finance Act, and giving agencies advice on the legislation that impacts their supply chain. And most important things for clients to start to look at is how they start to weave the IR35 status decisions into their business as usual or their hiring process. So probably taking a step back from that is they need to decide when they need a contractor first. Because of the change in responsibility for IR35, that it's now going to become the client's responsibility to make that determination, it's important that they decide almost a decision tree of when they need a contractor. So is that going to be a contractor that's going to work directly for them? Is that going to be a contractor that they source themselves through their internal recruitment team and pay themselves, which then in turn makes them the fee payer in the legislation as well? Or is it going to be via one of their recruitment partners? So they need to make that decision early on. And then there's also the option where they may look to go down the statement of work route, which is something that can be becoming ever increasingly popular as well.
Obviously, if you are using an external agency, there is a potential risk there. Obviously, you're not managing that process. What are the end risks for the employers if they go down that agency route?
The supply chain working closer together has never been more important. I think where the supply chain may have been disparate in the past and not been collectively working together, it's now really important that they do, because there is risk in that supply chain right the way through, right from the client to their recruitment partner and any other providers in that supply chain. If you're using a recruitment agency or an external recruitment agency to hire your contractors, one of the major benefits is that they're going to manage some of that supply chain risk for you, and they're going to take on some of the management of that and have probably been doing that for a number of years now. So they'll be well experienced in assessing the supply chain and making sure that those providers and payroll providers that are further down the supply chain are compliant and doing the due diligence. There are risks obviously as well in terms of IR35. The way that the IR35 legislation is changing means that the client is responsible for making the determination when the person or the intermediary that pays them, normally the agency, the fee payer, will be liable for any unpaid tax and national insurance contributions. However, in the legislation there is also a transfer of debt liability, which means that if HMRC investigate and they're unable to recoup the deficit of national insurance contributions and tax, then they will look at that supply chain and look to be able to move up the supply chain if they're unable to collect the unpaid tax and national insurance contributions.
What would be your questions that you should possibly ask those recruitment agencies, just to make sure that they do know what they're doing and that those risks are as small as possible? Probably
one of the most important things to look for is accreditations. So recruitment agencies obviously have their own accreditations, and they do the same with their intermediaries and their payroll providers. So they will normally put together a preferred suppliers list of providers. They'll normally have 3 or 4 providers, and they will select them based on their compliance and their service experience for their contractors. One of the best ways one of the best organisations to look for is the FCSA, which is the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association. There's a code of conduct that all providers have to adhere to, making sure that they're compliant and offering compliant UK payroll vehicles.
How does IR35 work with an ATS, for example?
Yeah, so currently it probably won't, and that's something that clients need to start to look at now. So they'll be using applicant tracking systems, they might be using a vendor management system, there'll be lots of different platforms that they're using for whether it's contingent workers or full-time employees that they're recruiting. So I think one of the most important things is to try and figure out how that can fit into their new norm or their business as usual post-April. So how can clients go out and source the best IT talent or the best project managers if they haven't got their IR35 process right, so the contractor doesn't know what the take-home pay is going to be? So they've got to start to weave that IR35 status determination into their talent strategy. That then leads you to the question around tech. How does that fit into that? So when you're distributing your roles through your vendor management system to your agency, it needs to let them know what the status determination statement is, or have a way of being able to send that and outsource that to a company that you've chosen to do your IR35 status. So it's really important that people start to look at how they can weave that tech together. Some of the things that we've been doing in Brookson over the past 6 or 12 months now is starting to develop open APIs into our technology so we can start to work with different providers across the marketplace. We've been talking to vendor management suppliers and to applicant tracking systems of how we can start to integrate or interoperability and work together on those. So I think that's something that's really key, that's done early on as well. Otherwise, there'll be a chunk of a problem now to educate and get the IR35 status decision right. There'll be an even bigger problem post-April when people can't recruit the talent they need because they haven't got the processes right.
And you mentioned earlier around the statement of work, and it's obviously something that's becoming increasingly popular. Some organisations will have one, some won't. What would be your sort of recommendation? Would it be something that you would suggest people have?
I think on the lead up to the delayed reforms in April 2020, the term statement of work became increasingly popular. I think it was seen as a silver bullet to the legislation, and done incorrectly it can have really bad and devastating effects on that supply chain. And the reason being is that if it's a contrived statement of work and it is simply a time and materials, a contractor coming in to do a project and the client is managing them to that project, then that isn't a statement of work and the client is still responsible and liable for making that determination. So it's really important that where a statement of work is done, that it's done correctly.
And obviously there'll be a lot of tools, technologies and solutions for getting IR35 right. Are there any recommendations that you could pass on?
Yeah, I suppose you can probably put the different solutions into probably three categories. There is the traditional, I suppose, consultancy services that you can get, where they'll come in and give you some advice and education and pay for those services, but you're probably not going to get a huge amount of help actually doing the status determination statements, or you're going to need to do a lot of that heavy lifting yourself. Mm-hmm. There are automated and online tools that work through answering a series of questions and algorithms making the decision for you. It's obviously a much quicker, simpler and probably cheaper process than the consultancy service. The main drawback there is that the legislation is very grey, can be very difficult to make a decision, and things like the HMRC's CES tool have a habit of coming back with an answer of they can't make a determination at that time. So there can be issues around that. And then I suppose the last one is to find someone that can give you a blend of both. And that's again what we've been looking to do with the time that's been afforded to us. We've built our own systems and processes to allow us to do that. But the most important part is that the status determination is still made by a qualified expert in IR35 rather than it being through a series of questions. So I think it's working out what fits best for you as a client.
Are there any sort of key considerations or sort of top tips for employers when they're thinking about that sort of supply chain sort of business that you could recommend?
Yeah, I suppose from what I've seen over the last 12 months, one of the most important things is to start to think about your processes, policies and procedures in advance. If you leave this to the last minute, it's January, February, you're going to make mistakes and things are going to go wrong. The earlier you start, the more prepared you're going to be. And thinking about the policies, procedures, processes right from the very start of when you decide you're going to hire a contractor is the most important part. Because actually that IR35 journey should start right at the very point when you decide you need a contractor. So rather than it's a full-time employee, there's no need to worry. If it's a contractor, then you need to decide how they're going to get paid. And I think the earlier you think about that, the better. And then starting to educate your hiring managers really early. Some of the things that I've witnessed over the last 6 to 12 months has been clients not understanding IR35 and putting their contractors in danger of IR35 because they've treated them differently. So actually where they've treated them like employees when they shouldn't be. They should be treating them like self-employed professionals. So starting to get almost like a policy book and making sure they've got their processes right, training their hiring managers, and just making sure they start early enough to make sure they've got enough time before the legislation comes in.
Thank you for joining, and hopefully people have got some insight as to IR35 and business as usual.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.